Okay, here we are again. We're going to try to end this lecture series so that we can be able to move right on into the Civil War. In the first half of the 19th century, politicians either ignored or avoided a number of social issues, including alcoholism, the quality of public education, slavery, as well as women's rights. Reformers, working largely as individuals, but also through organizations, were left to tackle these problems in many ways on their own. So let's start off with talking about the temperance movement. By the early 19th century, the per capita consumption of hard liquor, which is whiskey, brandy, rum, gin, had grown dramatically to more than 5 gallons a year. The high level of consumption was blamed for poverty as well as abuse. Working men would spend their wages on alcohol instead of rent or food, and then they were frequently absent from their factory jobs. Alcohol abuse contributed to the abuse of wives and children. So in 1826, the American Temperance Society began a persistent campaign against the evils of drinking. The movement caught on, especially in New England, much less so in the South, and by the 1840s, national consumption had dropped to half of what it had been 2 decades earlier. There was a demand for free public education, which started to grow during the 1830s as the franchise expanded, so as more people were allowed to vote. When we talk about the franchise, that's what we're specifically talking to is, the franchise has expanded, so there are less restrictions on those who are legally allowed to vote. This still does not include women. It still does not include slaves, obviously, and it doesn't include anybody who is not of Anglo or European ancestry. No one who's white. So as the franchise expanded, there is a further demand for free public education. Education was deemed important for creating an informed electorate, so they needed, they thought that by having voters who could read and voters who were educated, that they would have a better society sort of overall, and people who could make the best choices based on the material available. In addition, factory workers wanted their children to have more opportunities than what they had, so schooling was seen as a way, to push them on. But it was also seen as a way to assimilate immigrant children, or the children of immigrants, through the inculcation of American values. Already existing schools generally taught the 3 R's, and please understand that these words do not all start with R, okay? So the 3 R's: reading, which does start with R, writing, which starts with W, I hope you know that, and arithmetic, but they would call it just arithmetic, so an A goes before that word. So reading, writing, arithmetic. And they would teach this to a room full of boys and girls whose ages might have run anywhere from like 3 to 18. Reformers found that system inadequate for preparing students to succeed in a society that was changing rapidly, mostly due to industrialization. Massachusetts, as it had during the early colonial period, took the lead in promoting education. In 1827, Massachusetts passed a law that provided for the establishment of high schools and set guidelines for curricula based on community size. One of the results of the changes to education was an increase in women teachers. The first high school for girls was opened in New York in 1821, and Oberlin College was established as a co-educational institution in 1833. Mount Holyoke was founded in 1837 as a women's college, and Judson College in Marion, Alabama began in 1838, and that happens to be my alma mater. That's where I went and received my bachelor's degree. Educational reform was more successful in the North than in the South, where even white illiteracy was high. African Americans did not benefit from improvements in public education. Free blacks, they attended poor segregated schools, and slaves generally received no formal education at all. Oh, I'm so sorry. It's getting kind of late. Notably, one institution of higher learning, again, this is Oberlin College, admitted blacks as well as women. So it's not just coeducational, it's multicultural, it's multi-ethnic. Another reform that starts taking place in the 19th century is that of women's rights. The various reform movements of the 19th century gave women, and particularly middle-class women, an opportunity to participate in public life. And they were mainly successful in their efforts. This was a drastic change from life before. A prime example is the work of Dorothea Dix to create public mental health institutions that would provide humane care for the insane. Now, we have to remember that the insane, as the 19th century would have defined them, that could include someone who was suffering from depression or anxiety. So this really is meant to be a reform for those suffering from mental illness sort of overall. Where was I going with that? So American women started to turn their attention to their own situation when activists split from the abolitionists. Women were very highly involved in the abolitionist movement. The specific event that led to the organized push for women's rights was the exclusion, or the leaving out, right, of a group of American women from the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. 100 women met in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, so 8 years later, and they were led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Both of them were abolitionist activists, and they worked together with those present at the Seneca Falls Convention to draft a statement of women's rights. The Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions called for equality for women before the law. It includes changes in divorce laws that automatically gave custody of children to their husband. It called for equal employment opportunities as well as the right to vote. These were all very, very high priorities to the women, so much so that they began to move away from the abolitionist movement in order to focus specifically on women's rights. The idea was, if we can focus on women's rights and receive rights for women, then we will be able to more actively engage the abolitionist movement and make changes there. So now let's talk about the abolitionist movement. The women are highly involved in this. There is a number of men as well. But this was a touchy subject in the 19th century. Congress considered slavery so controversial that in 1836, the House of Representatives, largely at the insistence of Southerners, passed a gag rule prohibiting discussion or debate of slavery. So Congress has passed a gag rule that is basically like a piece of legislation that says you are not allowed to talk about it. Put a gag over your mouth. You are not allowed to talk about slavery. Not all Americans who opposed slavery favored simply just putting an end to it. Some considered slavery to be wrong, but they were unwilling to take action against it. Others accepted slavery in the states where it already existed, but they opposed its expansion into new territories. An early anti-slavery proposal was to repatriate slaves to Africa, but only about 15,000 blacks immigrated to Liberia, a number far below the natural increase in the slave population that accounted for most of the population's growth before the Civil War. Abolitionists were advocates of an immediate end to slavery. And the movement's chief spokesperson was William Lloyd Garrison, who began publishing his anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831. His American Anti-Slavery Society called for the immediate abandonment, quote unquote, of slavery without compensation to slaveholders, the end to the domestic slave trade, and radically, he wants the recognition of the equality of blacks and whites. The abolitionists, however, were divided on how best to achieve these goals. The movement split in 1840, once again, over the appropriate role of women within the organization. So even though women such as Angelina and Sarah Grimke, who have a very big connection to Louisiana, were deeply committed to the cause, many members of the society felt it was inappropriate for women to speak before predominantly male audiences. More important, there was significant opposition to the inclusion of women's rights issues under the umbrella of the abolitionist program. Now, that stated, women have a big role to play in the abolitionist movement, but the strongest supporters obviously are going to be free blacks. They're also their most effective speakers. So escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass provided Northerners with vivid first-hand accounts of slavery. Douglass's book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, was just one of many slave autobiographies popular in abolitionist circles. While most blacks supported a peaceful end to slavery, some believed that only insurrection, only violence could actually bring it about. So this sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? If we think about the civil rights movement, we have people like Martin Luther King Jr., who's advocating civil disobedience, right? Peaceful demonstrations, peaceful disobedience. But then others like Malcolm X who are okay with violence and seeing violence used. Resistance to slavery took several forms. Slaves would pretend to be sick, refuse to work, do their jobs poorly. They might even sabotage things. They like destroy farm equipment, set fire to buildings, or steal food. These were all individual acts, though, rather than a part of an organized plan for revolt. But the objective was to upset the routine of the plantation in any way possible. And that's not to say that there weren't any slave insurrections, because there were, but none of them were overly successful. On some plantations, slaves could bring grievances about harsh treatment from an overseer to their master, and hope that he would intercede on their behalf. Although many slaves tried to run away, few succeeded for more than a few days, and they often returned on their own. So escapes like this were more of a protest. It was a demonstration that it could in fact be done, rather than a dash for freedom. Advertisements in southern newspapers seeking the return of runaway slaves made clear that the goal of most runaways was to find their wives or children who had been sold to another planter. They're looking for family. The Underground Railroad was a series of safe houses for runaways, organized by abolitionists and run by former slaves like Harriet Tubman, who helped about 1,000 slaves reach the North. Excuse me. Oh, it's very late for me. You can see that it's only, what, 7:57. Oh, I'm getting old, you guys. Where are we? Early in 1832, the Virginia state legislature considered a proposal for gradual emancipation, with owners compensated for their loss. Although the measure brought about an open debate on the merits of slavery, it failed in both houses, but by only comparatively small margins. Ironically, Virginia and then other southern states then moved in the opposite direction and opted for greater control over the black population. So we see new slave codes being passed in each state, which increased patrols to locate runaway slaves and guard against new outbreaks of violence. This ultimately prohibits African Americans from holding any kind of meetings, so this would include worship times. It denied free blacks the right to own any kind of weapon, and it made it illegal to educate a slave, and at times outlawed the manumission or the freeing of slaves by their owners. Those who defend slavery use some very interesting means. The debate in Virginia legislature coincided with the publication of William Lloyd Garrison's first issue of The Liberator. The moral attack that the abolitionists mounted against slavery called for a new defense from the South. So rather than emphasize that slavery was profitable or as a labor system essential to the health of the Southern economy, suddenly we see slave proponents turning to the Bible, to history, and even science. They claimed to find ample support for slavery in both the Old and the New Testaments, and pointed out that the great civilizations of the ancient world, Egypt, Greece, Rome, that these were all slave societies. Probably the most ludicrous defense of slavery was that enslavement was actually good for African Americans. Slaves were happy and content under the paternal care of their master and his family, toward whom the slaves felt a very special affection. That talking of liberty and freedom was irrelevant because slaves could not even understand those concepts. The proponents of slavery also maintained that slaves on plantations in the South were better off than the, quote, wage slaves or the white wage slaves in northern factories where business owners had no real investment in their workers. In contrast, they would argue, planters had every incentive to make sure their slaves were well fed, clothed, and housed. Harsh masters, more often than not, were northerners who had moved to the South rather than those born and bred in the region, they claimed. But obviously, underlying all these arguments was a fundamental belief in the superiority of whites. Public discussion of slavery and its abolishment effectively ended in the South after 1832. All segments of white society, for the most part, supported slavery, whether they owned slaves or not. The growing isolation of the South was reflected by splits in several Protestant denominations over the slavery question. In 1844, the Methodist Episcopal Church was established as a separate organization, and a year later, Southern Baptists formed their own group, the Southern Baptist Convention. Does that sound familiar? That is why the Southern Baptist Convention was birthed. Not only did Southerners try to counter the abolitionists in print, they wanted to help in suppressing the anti-slavery movement altogether. In 1835, the South Carolina legislature called on the northern states to make it a crime to publish or distribute anything that could possibly incite a slave revolt. The resolutions made it very clear that South Carolina considered slavery an internal issue, right, a states' rights issue, and that any attempt to interfere would be unlawful and resisted. I'm sorry, I need to move around. The existence of slavery was just the most visible difference between the North and the South. The two regions' economies had been complementary, but by most measures, the number of railroads, canals, factories urban centers, as well as the balance between agriculture and industry, for the most part, these regions are moving in opposite directions. The reform movement that arose in the decades before the Civil War made few inroads in the South because any calls for social change were associated with abolitionism. Although wealthy planters hired tutors for their children, and many of their sons went on to college, even public education was considered not particularly important in the South. In the North, the rejection of slavery as an institution did not mean that there was widespread support for extending full political rights, let alone social equality, to African Americans. It was over the status of slavery in the new territories of the West that the sectional lines dividing the nation became rigid. With California ready for statehood in 1850, a solution to the problem of the extension of slavery raised by the Mexican cession could no longer be delayed. Although President Taylor was, the head of the Whigs, he had little political clout. The Whigs turned to Henry Clay, who was responsible for the Missouri Compromise of 1820, as well as the settlement of the nullification controversy, to devise another compromise that would satisfy all factions. In January 1850, Clay presented a series of resolutions known as the Omnibus Bill, which addressed all outstanding slavery questions. According to the bill, California would be admitted to the Union as a free state. New Mexico and Utah would be organized as territories with the status of slavery to be decided by popular sovereignty, so by the people. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, would be terminated in D.C. The fugitive slave law would be strengthened. Congress would declare that it had no right to interfere in the interstate slave trade. The disputed boundary between Texas and New Mexico would be adjusted, and the United States would assume the pre-annexation debt of Texas. The Omnibus Bill failed because all of the measures had to be voted on as a package. It was a package deal, all or none. Senator Stephen Douglas, a Democrat from Illinois, rescued the compromise by pushing through 5 separate bills, each of which independently drew enough support to pass. In addition to admitting California as a free state, the Compromise of 1850 included the following 4 pieces of legislation. 1. The Texas and New Mexico Act, under which New Mexico became a territory without restrictions on slavery. That is, the matter was to be settled by popular sovereignty, and the boundary between Texas and New Mexico was settled. 2. The Utah Act, which established Utah as a territory under the same terms as New Mexico regarding slavery. 3. An amendment to the Fugitive Slave Act, which put all cases involving runaway slaves under the federal jurisdiction in a manner that clearly favored slave owners. And lastly, the act abolishing the slave trade in the District of Columbia, which did exactly what its title indicates. It abolished commerce in slaves in the capital city, effective January 1, 1851, with the further provision that the District of Columbia could not be used as a shipping point for the purpose of sale. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is one that is rather interesting here. Although the running away of slaves was never a serious problem, the new fugitive slave law was the one major victory the South won from the Compromise of 1850. It was also the most controversial. Special commissioners were appointed to hear cases regarding fugitives and could issue warrants for the arrest of runaway slaves. The commissioners received $10 for every alleged runaway returned to his or her owner. And I know it sounds like, ooh, $10, but back then $10 was, quite a bit. The commissioners, would receive only $5 if it was determined that the slave should not be returned. Slaves who claimed to be free were not permitted to testify in their own defense. and they did not have recourse to a jury trial. Anyone who interfered with the capture of fugitive slaves faced heavy fines, and obstructing the return of a slave was punishable by fines, imprisonment, as well as civil liabilities. Despite the law's enforcement provisions, several northern states enacted personal liberty laws, which prohibited officials from aiding in the recovery of fugitive slaves. Occasionally, violence broke out when a crowd of abolitionists tried to, rescue slaves who were about to be brought before commissioners. The refusal of many Northerners to cooperate with agents exercising their rights under the law made the Fugitive Slave Act a dead letter as soon as it was enacted. Now, let's talk about the Dred Scott decision. As a slave, Dred Scott had been taken by his master from the slave state of Missouri to the free state of Illinois, and then to the free territory of Wisconsin, where they lived during the 1830s. After his master died, Dred Scott tried to buy his freedom. When that failed, he sought relief in the courts. He claimed that although he had been brought back to Missouri, his past residence in a free state and territory had made him a free person. The Supreme Court's decision effectively rejected Scott's claim from the outset. This stated that Scott was a slave, not a citizen of either the United States or Missouri, and therefore had no right to bring suit in the federal courts. From the time the Constitution was ratified, African Americans were regarded, and this is a quote from someone, as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations. End quote. Furthermore, Justice Taney declared that the Missouri Compromise, which had created the concept of free and slave states based on geography, had been unconstitutional from its inception because it violated the Fifth Amendment's protection of property. So the Dred Scott decision, kind of important, because basically it says that people who are of African descent are not citizens. Senator Douglas did not anticipate the violence that would accompany the creation of the Kansas Territory, as both pro-slavery and anti-slaveries rushed in to gain control of the government. Senator Douglas was the author of what was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it created two territories. It created Kansas and Nebraska. That's why they call it the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It declared the Missouri Compromise null and void, and the matter of slavery in the new territories would be decided by popular sovereignty. So here are all these pro-slavery and anti-slavery supporters running in to get control of the government, specifically in Kansas Territory. Competing territorial legislatures were established in 1855, and the Free State drafted a constitution prohibiting not only slavery but also the settling of free blacks in Kansas. On May 21st, 1856, a pro-slavery mob attacked the Free State stronghold at Lawrence, burning buildings and destroying property. A man by the name of John Brown, who was a militant abolitionist, with a small band of supporters, retaliated by killing 5 men at Pottawatomie Creek a few days later. Violence then erupted in the U.S. Senate over Kansas. Charles Sumner of Massachusetts condemned Southerners for their actions in Kansas in extremely strong language. Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, decided to punish Sumner for his insults, and he beat him with his cane in a confrontation in the Senate chamber. Onlookers from the South didn't do anything to help Sumner. I laugh. It's not really funny, but it kind of is, because he beats him with a cane. But that's just not good. Not good to have that happen in the halls of Congress. In 1860, the Republicans had nominated a very skinny, tall man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. The Democratic Party, faced with the challenge of choosing someone who could appeal to all their factions, split in two. Eventually, they selected Stephen Douglas for their candidate, the decision that ultimately split the party. When the Democratic Party divided, Lincoln's election was effectively guaranteed. Although Douglas did relatively well in the popular vote, Lincoln won every state north of the Mason-Dixon line, along with California and Oregon. And with just 40% of the popular vote, Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860. Lincoln's election was the signal for secession, for some states to begin pulling out. Not surprising, South Carolina left first on December 20th, 1860, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Representatives of these 7 states met in Montgomery, Alabama in February of 1861 to form the Confederate States of America, and they also began to draft a new constitution, electing Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as their first president. Last-minute efforts to compromise failed. Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky tried to work out an arrangement whereby owners of runaway slaves could be compensated for their loss, and to amend the Constitution to bar the federal government from interfering with slavery in the South. But, by this time, events had already moved beyond compromise, and the Republicans rejected Crittenden's proposal in any event. The crucial issue here was no longer slavery itself, but whether the southern states would be allowed to secede. What has more power, individual states or the federal government? By the time Lincoln took office in March, the Confederacy had already commandeered federal arsenals, post office, government buildings, and most military installations within its territory. Fort Sumter, located on an island in Charleston Harbor, was still in the hands of the United States. Buchanan had tried to send reinforcements and supplies to the fort, but he backed off when the relief ship was fired upon from the mainland shore. I would back off too. Lincoln tried another approach, announcing that he was sending in just food and medical supplies, not additional, troops or ammunition. The South could not abide a continued Union presence in Charleston, and early on April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. The U.S. forces surrendered the next day. The South, they'd fired the first shot, and Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the insurrection. Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee joined the Confederacy the next month. Thus, we have the beginning of the U.S. Civil War. So, lots of really interesting things taking place during this time period. Thank you for being so diligent as to listen to these very many lectures. And when we come back together on Wednesday, we will pick up where we left off with getting into the American Civil War. Have a great weekend. Be safe over your holiday. I look forward to seeing you soon.